Welcome to the International Meditation Hour. As you all know, we gather once per quarter to discuss meditation, discuss consciousness, human potential, and I'd like to feature those who are out in the world doing some amazing work surrounding these ideas. So, as you know, my name is Dr. Baruti KMT-Sisouvong. My wife and I here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, serve as the directors for the Transcendental Meditation Program. I am also the founder and chief meditation officer for Transcendental Brain here in the metropolitan area as well. Joining us today is Chiraag Kankariya. He is a graduating student from Babson College, and he has a fantastic story, a wonderful initiative. And I'd like to introduce Chiraag and discuss his initiative, and then we'll pose a few questions. And as always, we'll have a 20-minute meditation at about 20 minutes in. And then after the meditation, we'll have some additional conversation with Chiraag and any questions from those who are in attendance as well. So Chiraag, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone. First of all, Dr. Ruthie, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. My name is Chirag. I'm a senior at Babson College, originally from New Jersey. And last semester, actually, I started the club on Babson's campus called Dharma Circle. And we focus on exploring the topics of consciousness, meditation, spirituality, and mindfulness, specifically through an Eastern perspective. And the reason I did this was because I felt like a lot of students, especially my age, have a spiritual inclination, but in my opinion, I felt that a lot of the spiritual discourse on college campuses was kind of tethered toward one religion or the other, and a lot of it was always overlooking a lot of the ancient Eastern traditions where a lot of these practices and contemplative practices stem from. And so I want to create a space for students to be able to explore these types of things through the frameworks from which they originated. So, whether you want to consider Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, any of the ancient Sikhism, Jainism, whatever the ancient East religion is, I thought it'd be a great way to incorporate that. We had a pilot session with the Sadhguru Center for a Conscious Planet at Harvard. We had a hatha yoga teacher come in, and we did a yoga session and meditation session with them. It was great. We plan to renew that with them this semester for 5 weeks. And in January, I had a vision basically to connect all the different people, institutions, academics, researchers, scientists, everyone who falls under this umbrella of meditation, wellness, and spirituality, and kind of put them under one platform because I felt like right now everyone exists in their own individual silos. And I want to create a platform basically to show people what could be possible when all these different people, all these different voices within this community connect, and how we can, advance the discourse around a lot of these topics so that we could make it more palatable perhaps for the mainstream audience so that, people could benefit from this. And that's where my, ultimate vision is. And from that, I created the idea of the conference to have an example of what this could look like. So I'm hosting a conference on April 25th called the Conscious Future Society Conference, bringing together a lot of great people, Dr. Bruti included in one of those speakers. And just want to show people what's possible when we bridge the gaps between all these different disciplines, along with modern science and ancient spirituality. And the end goal is to increase human consciousness and human awareness so that we could create a better and more sustainable future for ourselves.
Excellent points. And you just actually covered my first question, which was really the question of the origin and the impulse. And the question I had, and you may want to flesh this out if something else resonates with you, what was the deeper impulse behind creating the conscious future society? Not just the idea itself, but the moment of realization that made you feel that it was necessary. And since you seem to cover the first portion of the query, let's talk about the moment of realization that occurred for you that made it abundantly necessary to launch
Mhm.
the conscious future society.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so for the last 2, 3 years, I've been rust. So I go to Babson is a fully entrepreneurship school, full business school.
Mhm.
And for my most of my life, I knew I wanted to do entrepreneurship or have my own thing. And I kind of over the last 3, 4 years, I knew I wanted to do social entrepreneurship, something that helps the
Mhm.
world. I felt like I came from a very privileged background, and the best thing I could do with what I was given was help others or help the world around me. And so my first thought and my first instinct about 2 years ago was to start something within the environment. I'm a big environmentalist, and I thought maybe I could do something within renewable energies or creating a nonprofit that would help the environment somehow, some way. I did a lot of research into that, and I got some initiatives going, but nothing too crazy. And over the last year, as I delved deeper into this meditation industry and niche, I should say, um, one of the conclusions I came to was a lot of the problems that I see, because there's a lot of problems that I feel like I want to solve in the world. And of course, I'm just one person, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there with the same aspirations and same ambitions. But I felt like a lot of the problems that I see in the world, and of course, this is just my own opinion, I felt like a lot of them kind of stem from a human consciousness problem. And I felt that a lot of the solutions that we see place in the world today. And not to knock any of them, there's people out there who are doing so much research, much smarter than I am. But I just feel like a lot of the solutions that are out there are kind of bandage solutions because we always open the door up for something else to inevitably return because there's something fundamentally not evolved
Mhm.
within our consciousness that causes us to go back into these cycles of whatever it may be for the problems we see in the world, like environmental degradation, poverty, wealth inequality, whatever it may be. And I felt like the root cause of all of that came down to it was consciousness and human well-being. And I feel like if we're able to attack that core problem of how can we make a human being more conscious and because as a result of that, they can make more conscious decisions going forward in the future. I think we can create a much better future for ourselves in society.
Thank you for that detailed reply. It gets into what we've talked about before, my own work in terms of the model for perpetual growth and progress that grew out of my doctoral research and the seven layers of manifestation that grew out of it as well. And you talk about how there's so many things we have in society, they're being disconnected from pure consciousness. They're being disconnected from the fundamental aspect of who and what we are, not just as a species on this planet, but as participants within the grander universe. And those seven layers of manifestation begin with pure consciousness. It goes from pure consciousness to universal and natural laws to the phenomenal world into which we're born, and we are a part of that. You then have human consciousness being that fulcrum between the pure consciousness and, of course, then the human derived world that we as humans create, which then, of course, gives rise to our constructs and our outcomes. And you're speaking of our constructs and outcomes because our human consciousness is so bereft of an understanding that fundamentally we're within a universe first and foremost. And it allows us, the lack of understanding of that reality allows us to then behave in ways that aren't the best, neither for ourselves, but also for the world around us at large, such that we can, to your point about societal degradation and the planet's degradation, we can basically take from the planet without ever thinking about the long-term consequences, not for just our present generation, but for successive generations. And this gets into really my next question about the import of inner development. You discuss these things and highlight inner development as a drive for societal change. So how do you see inner development functioning as a kind of, let me call it, an invisible infrastructure for the future?
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. I think the biggest driver that I see people with who want to create social change in the world is they always have a first of all a great sense of self, and they always have a very good internal emotional state or internal well-beingness, if you will. I feel like there's a great quote. I mean, it's not a direct quote, but it's from a spiritual master named Osho from India, and he says, you can only give what you have, and I
Mhm.
feel like that resonates super true with the thing I was talking about before about bandit solutions, and I think that when someone develops their inner self and their spiritual self enough, you kind of naturally have that drive to give back and to create a better world around you. Whereas, that's why a lot of times I feel like I can't really blame someone who does participate in degradatory practices because, if I had lived their life experience, I probably would be the same exact way. And I think the best way to create a sustainable solution for things like that is we have to give people a way to increase or augment their internal environment and their internal experience, so that, eventually that's going to just lead to a multiplying effect down the road.
Your Osho quote immediately brings to mind one of my favorite quotes comes from Benjamin Elijah Mays, past president of Morehouse College, where he says, "The circumference of life cannot
Mhm.
be rightly drawn until the center is set." Now, you notice he says the circumference of life, the things around us,
Yeah.
can't be rightly drawn. He didn't say they couldn't be drawn. He said they couldn't be rightly drawn until the center is set. And so you're speaking of, Mays is speaking of, and a host of others, Osho as well, that if you attend to that single flame, and that single flame can be attended by virtue of consciousness practice, consciousness-based practices such as meditation,
Mhm.
you strengthen that flame and you
Mhm.
continue to move into the world with that center having been set. And the things that you then produce coming from that calm center, that core, come to reflect that inner being that's resident within everyone and everything as we participate in this grand dance within the universe itself. We're never apart from, but are fundamentally connected to that thing. And as a result of that, we come to live our lives in much more whole ways versus being very fragmented. And that then allows us to produce things that are going to be beneficial, not just for ourselves, but also for the people with whom we come into contact. And at that point, we're really getting to a question of bridging worlds, because oftentimes, most often people will believe that they are apart from, as opposed to being a part of. And I'm sure you know this quote that comes from Rumi, where he says, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll
Yeah.
meet you there. When the
Mhm.
soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, languages, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. But he's talking about consciousness, pure consciousness. He's talking about walking into the world with a greater sense of self and awareness and navigating the world with much more clarity that comes because you've tended that inner flame. And he talks about the importance of bridging worlds in this instance as well, which gets into your work about bringing together science, spirituality, and entrepreneurship, to you mentioned that the domains, they don't always speak to one another. We don't speak the same language, if you will. We
Mhm.
remain oftentimes in our silos. And as a result of that, we are derisive toward the quote other group, and as a result of that, thinking that our knowledge is primary and this other knowledge is maybe tertiary at best, when in reality all of it came, if we go back to the model, the seven layers of manifestation, it's coming from the construct in our outcomes, and it comes
Yeah.
from a limited understanding of the processes from human consciousness and the impact it has on the human derived world, which then begs the question, what have you learned about how those worlds can actually begin to understand one another? How can science, how can spirituality, how can philosophy, how can these various domains of understanding become much more cohesive and work much more collaboratively?
I think that's super important. I think there's people who are already doing such great work. Actually, one of the inspirations that I have to give credit to for my conference and for the society I'm creating is to Dr. Bala Subramaniam from Harvard. And I think he was one of the pioneering people who kind of put forth this idea of bringing together all these different people in one room. And he started the Sadhguru Center at Harvard, and he hosted the conference of consciousness for 2 years now. And he was one of the first names I've seen, at least. There's probably a lot more, but one of the first names I've seen on such a mainstream level to bring together such huge names and talk about how, this, like for example, a scientist like Dean Radin coming together and talking about the science of magic and bring together what I'll never forget this. I was at the conference just last September, and Dean Radin posted a quote from the former president of the American Statistics Association, and the quote was it was talking about consciousness related anomalies, and the former president said if perhaps this was about any other topic it would be more statistically significant for all the other researchers within this field, but because it's about this one thing people aren't taking it as serious. And so it just, I think it's a matter of being more open to it, just as a society, and then for us people within this space talking about it more. I feel like there's a lot of kind of hesitation to talk about these more esoteric spiritual practices, just because it's kind of come across as a lot of woo-woo or not scientifically validated stuff before. But now that now that we have spoken the language of academia, through works of people like Sarah Lazar or Bala Subramaniam, now there is scientific validation, and now there's a bigger door open for these conversations to happen. And I feel like the best way to do it is just exactly what Dr. Bala did, or maybe perhaps what I'm doing here, and what you're doing as well, is bringing all these people in a room together and saying, hey, this is what our end goal is. How can we work together across these disciplines to make this happen? Because at the end of the day, we can't just have spirituality, and we can't just have entrepreneurship. We can't just have social sciences or whatever it may be. We need a holistic approach, and working together to foster that future that we all want.
I'm so glad. Thank you for that response. I'm so glad that you brought up the conference that occurred, I believe it was in October of last
Yeah.
year. And I was in the audience, and it was cool that you posed one of the questions there. And then going through all the talks that were presented for the first time that I'm aware of, and particularly at Harvard, as we know, to have this conversation at Harvard is a huge thing, particularly the medical school.
Yeah.
And I think it was 2017 when I participated over at the Harvard Divinity School. We
Mhm.
had the Hacking Consciousness conference there, and I was on a panel for that with Jeffrey Rediger, Andreas Mercer from MIT, and Chris, I forget his last name, over at the Divinity School. We were all on this panel together discussing consciousness. And so to see this conversation continue is important. And to your point regarding Dean Radin, it was great to have the conversation between both Dean Radin and Sadhguru
That's
that
true.
Tuesday. That was a phenomenal conversation and really highlighted how at the end, and you'll remember this as well when Sadhguru stood up at the end and said, those of us who have these unique platforms, that when we have an opportunity to share ideas and information for the first time in human history, we can reach people at a moment's notice because of the ubiquity of the internet. The access is truly global and can share these ideas. And as my own mentor from graduate school, Dr. Fred Travis would often say that you create packets of knowledge, and it's in the creation of these packets of knowledge we know not which packet of knowledge is going to inform someone's thinking and action, as Maharshi would often say, to push them onto consciousness. And we
Yeah.
have this responsibility because we have this platform and it's going to serve well, and that it is now really being embraced by a new generation of scholars, myself, yourself, Bala, Sarah, and a host of others, to see that it's being embraced now much more readily. It portends very well for the future. And what I'd like to do is to continue this conversation as we prepare for the 25 April, Saturday, 25 April conference, because this is something that's important. This is the future of humanity, in my opinion. I had a friend of mine in undergrad. I rented a room in a house when I was beginning in undergrad, and a gentleman said to me that is the owner of the home. He said that as humans, we've studied the phenomenal world ad nauseum. We rarely study the inner world, and the real value of research has to turn its attention in an inward direction towards consciousness. Now, we know that, for example, with transcendental meditation, the first research was conducted in the 1970s, Dr. Robert Keith Wallace. And of course, we all know the resistance to that. We all know that Bala, has had his own challenges within the academy approaching
Yeah,
these
sure.
conversations. And
Yeah.
similarly, so with Sarah and a host of others. But the time is now for these conversations to come to the
Mhm.
fore. And the fact that you have this resistance strongly suggests that these conversations, these packets of knowledge, if you will, they're beginning
Mhm.
to have an impact.
Mhm.
And as they begin to have this impact, you begin to create this groundswell that has a truly beneficial effect, not just for the short term, but for the long term. So I want to commend you for your work. I want to commend you for pulling this conference together because as we talked when we had our initial conversation, you shared with me some of the challenges. I know them firsthand, and I have to say publicly to congratulate you on what is sure to be a fantastic discussion
Thank you.
and will definitely serve as a ground for those who are in attendance and those who hear about it to really begin to take some serious internal action to think and to become better and to become better stewards of this thing that we call reality that we as humans have devised and created. So I want to thank you for that. So since we're coming up on the 20-minute mark as far as the meditation, what I typically do for everyone, and for those of you who will be joining for the first time, is that whatever tradition you practice, you'll be practicing that tradition for 20 minutes. Those who have no particular tradition, what I do is to offer a prompt, if you will, to ruminate over. And that prompt is when you close the eyes and you're seated comfortably, ask yourself this fundamental question: how have I come to be who and what I am? Again, that question is, how have I come to be who and what I am? And we will meditate for 20 minutes. So if you have a pranayama technique, practice your pranayama technique. If you're practicing asanas, practice your asanas. If you're engaging in a mindfulness or a contemplative technique or a transcendental meditation or a Zen technique, whichever tradition you practice, you will be practicing that for 20 minutes. I'll then bring us out at the 20-minute mark. We will then sit quietly with the eyes closed for about 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll move into the remainder of our discussion, and then we'll close it out right at the hour again to respect everyone's time. So again, I want to thank Chirag for joining us
Thank you.
today, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation after the meditation. So what we'll do is I'm going to pause the video.
Mhm.
We will meditate for 20 minutes, and then we shall return. Something that's very special about coming out of a meditation. It really is. It's a very relaxing, settling experience. So perhaps we can begin again. Chirag, after sitting in silence with us just now, what stood out for you most in that experience?
Honestly, today was a lot more distracted for me. I feel like I didn't have a super clear meditative session today. I think I was thinking about there was like a lot of things running through my mind before joining here as well. So a lot of today was just like mental push-ups of like bringing myself back to where I was. But no matter what, even with that, I always feels calming in the end. So it's good to do that, come back. and get a sense of peace.
I like that analogy of mental push-ups because that's really what it is. And it's having, I often say when teaching TM, that we cultivate this healthy indifference to the presence of thoughts. I mean, you know this, and those who have researched and practiced for some time know that we can't clear our mind of thoughts, but we can go beyond them. And
Mhm.
we can come back to whatever our practice may be, whether it be a pranayama technique or whether it's asanas, whether it's just sitting and observing the thoughts or moving through the physiology itself. And that's really important to be, I like that mental push-ups. I'm going to use that one. I like that one. It's really
I
good.
I got that from this is I mean this is the closest person I would consider my guru, except it's fully online. There's a guy named Dr. K Alok Kanoja. He
Mhm.
has a startup called Healthy Gamer GG, and
Mhm.
he's one of the best people I know who has bridged the gap between ancient wisdom and science. He was a psychiatrist at Harvard, I think, for a number of years, and before that he was studying to be a monk for like 7 years in India. And he used that term first, and I loved it. And I would recommend anyone who's into this space of like this bridging this gap, like he's the forefront leader for sure of one of those type of people who like he knows how to kind of bridge all these people, different people together and put it in a really cohesive and palatable way for people like me. He's a really good resource.
Excellent. And in addition to him, in addition
Yeah.
to Osho, in addition to Sadhguru, of course, who are some of the other influences that have guided your thinking to this point in your life? I say that because I know when I was, an undergrad student, how I came
Mhm.
to this knowledge, and we all come to it in different ways. So I'm always curious as to how fellow travelers have come to the knowledge. So who are some of the other influences that impacted your life?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Jain household, so I was always around religion, and I remember my first interaction or experience with meditation was my grandfather would have me sit cross-legged and then have me stare at my he would have me put my finger up like this and then have me stare at the dead center of my finger and just he would say concentrate on just your finger and do it for however long as you can. And I didn't know at the time, but that was my first experience with meditation. And then as I grew up, I started asking a lot more questions about religion, but then I didn't get the answers I got weren't satisfying enough, and so I kind of shunned it altogether. But then by junior, senior of my high school, I got into like stoicism and mindfulness, and then
Mhm.
that put me in a pipeline of spirituality. And then that's actually when I found Dr. K, Dr. Alok Kanoja, and then he's kind of who set me on my path of like real like deep delve into like meditation and spirituality. I would say Osho is definitely like a big part of my outlook on the world now as well. Like I love how poetic his words sound. I read some of Dhammapada from Buddha. I read
Mhm.
Bhagavad Gita, so that's
Mhm.
definitely some influential as well for me. And then also just my own family. My father is super influential in the way I have my outlook on life. Um, but I'd say definitely those four, and Sadhguru also, and then Krishnamurti.
Oh, Krishnamurti is another one. Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, yeah, wow. You just took me back to undergrad. I was in a bookstore on campus, and a friend of mine who had come down, he graduated from Harvard. He came back to Atlanta to go through it. I went through an initiation, and he was a part of it. And he came down from Harvard to do, actually, MIT, he was at MIT at the time doing his doctoral work. Came down, he went through the process as well. And he came to visit me a couple of years later, and he says, I think you'd like Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti. And I'd never heard of him before.
Mhm.
And I happened to be in the bookstore on campus, and this voice told me to turn around.
Mhm.
I was like, I turn around after kind of ignoring it for a few moments in this insistence. I turn around, and at eye level was the book on conflict by Krishnamurti. And
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
I was
He's
like,
great.
wow. And so I picked that book up, and I've since purchased many of them and read many of them over the years. And I've thoroughly enjoyed Krishnamurti's work and again Osho's works as well, and
Yeah.
thoroughly enjoyed them. And it's always awesome to have those influences in our lives. And that one quote that says the first half of our lives, we create our habits. And for the second half of our lives, our habits create us. And that's important to have that solid foundation as we move forward. I'm going to take a quick question from the audience. So if anyone has a quick question, please place it in the chat. And then I will pose the question to Chirag and then we'll have a quick discussion about it. But I'd love to hear from those who are in attendance. So please drop a quick question in the chat and then we will pose said question for discussion. So please, how do you plan on reaching the masses and giving them the hunger for this path to love and spirituality when their mental and emotional diets are filled with junk food. So please, Chirag, how do you plan to, present this to people, to the mass of people, when, as the questioner says, when the hunger for this path to love and spirituality, when their mental and emotional diets are filled with junk food. So please.
Yeah. This is something I actually have thought of recently. I thought that, I was thinking about all the great teachers in the world, and I always felt like, these great teachers, although they influence a lot of people, in my mind, I would always question like, how are they only influencing the people who are prone to be influenced? Like, are they actually going to the people who actually really, really need this, these contemplative practices. And so I think the approach is twofold. I think one is definitely what you talked about before, Dr. Baruti, is all the first thing and the only thing we can do is plant the seed. And that seed, however it grows later on, is up to, I guess, if you want to call it fate or destiny or that one person's free will, whatever it is. I think the first and I think responsibility we have is to plant the seed and to at least have people have the awareness of how these practices are available and how they could benefit you in their own life. And then the second thing is, I think making people observe and be more aware of their own experiences and before and after these practices. So I think a lot of times people kind of also still have to take a leap of faith, if you will, into meditation. And so I think the biggest thing is like, hey, like this is where you are right now in your own internal experience, and you can see for yourself. You don't have to believe. You don't have to look up. You don't have to have blind faith in anyone. You can see for yourself, like this is how my life was before, and this is how my life was after. And I think the biggest thing is experiential learning is probably the biggest factor for changing behavior. And so once you have that understanding of like, oh, this is what's possible. Like now I don't feel like I'm carrying all this burden anymore because, I've either meditated or I've dealt with this in some other way. Like you'll see the effects of it through these contemplative practices, and I think that's the best way to get people to change, or if we want them to change in that way. Yeah.
Excellent points, which then gets into my next question, this tension and integration. Many people feel this tension between this pull for personal growth and, of course, engaging with the world's challenges because, we do live in a phenomenal world. We do live in the human-derived world, and we, sadly for many of us, we have experienced the challenges that we as humans have created, some intentionally and some as outgrowth of earlier historical decisions. So, how do you navigate this balance that's required between personal growth and engaging with the world's challenges? How do you personally navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I found that pretty difficult as well. That's a question I've always asked the people in the spiritual world, in the spiritual realm, I should say, of like, because I always I like thinking about having ambitious goals of like dealing with certain problems, but then I feel like a lot of times I catch myself caught up in the, like kind of like the doom spill, like the doom cycle of, oh, this is going wrong and this is going wrong and this is going wrong and what do I do about this and this and this? And I think for me at least, the best thing is always the bigger picture, like the zoom out. It's like and also, it goes back to the experience thing. It's like, your internal experience kind of dictates the world around you. And if my internal experience is always just focusing on the negative things, that's all I'm going to see. And one of I don't know if this is a quote, but one of the learnings I've had from some people over the years is, whatever happens in the world is going to happen, whether I'm sad or I'm happy about it. And so it's better that I go on with a smile on my face, at least, knowing that I could do something about it rather than me also being a part of it.
Mm. That's a great point. That's a wonderful point because oftentimes we've got so much happening in the world, and oftentimes people can feel somewhat at a loss of how to navigate this. How is this going to impact my day to day? And one of the things that, I'll just share from my perspective is that when COVID occurred and a bunch of things were happening, met with a good friend of mine on campus for lunch, and he said the best thing that any of us can do who are meditating and who adhere to whichever tradition to which we adhere is
Mhm.
to double down on our practice
Yeah.
because the world needs more light in the world around us. And we can then come to serve as a point of reference, if you will, a point of reference of possibility as opposed to impossibility. I've often said we go from this idea of something being impossible to I'm possible. It begins with us. And as we do so, it becomes easier for us to navigate these challenging moments. And we come to have I hesitate to say it, but I'll say it this way, somewhat of a detachment, if you will, from
Mhm.
them in the sense that We recognize them for what they are, but we can also do what we can with what we have where we are. And that allows us to have the greater sense of autonomy and power that we can have amidst these larger forces. And
Yeah.
impossible can also be I'm possible. That's it. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. I'm possible. And the idea is that we are the locus of control. I remember years ago I read something that says it matters less what happens to us, but how we respond to that which happens to us. And that goes back to having this level of
Mhm.
inner stability, which gets me to another question I have for you, Chirag. It says consciousness can sometimes feel like an abstract or distant idea for many people. What have you found that helps make it more, for want of a better way of saying it, accessible for people in a real way in their everyday lives?
I think I always like to deal with it. Well, I mean, I like to deal with these things on like a very subjective level because I feel like that's the best way that at least I learn. I feel like talking about these things in the abstract always kind of confuses me. So one of the questions I saw, I think I was like just scrolling online somewhere, and then there was a meditative like person on Instagram or something, and they asked the question of who is the watcher of your thoughts, and that
Mm,
really stuck with me. And it was like, okay, well, I think there's also in the Bhagavad Gita as well, they talk about the subject observer relationship. And it's like, the subject and the observer cannot, the subject and the object of observation cannot be the same thing. And then that forced me to realize, like, that, like, kind of forced me into this thinking pattern of, okay, well, I notice my thoughts. I know what my thoughts are, but then there's something that's inherently aware of those thoughts.
mm.
And what is that thing? And can I be aware of the awareness? And then, things like that. I think that helped me like kind of understand what it means, um, learning that everyone has a subjective experience. It's just a matter of tapping into it and realizing that you're not really your thoughts, and you could because your thoughts can change in an instant, even without your own free will or your own will to want them to do whatever they want because they're going to act on their own accord.
And so, a simple invitation if someone is just beginning to explore this question of inner development, I know I often recommend people discuss TM or look at TM. What would
Mhm.
you recommend for someone to take as a simple step that, want to begin this journey of understanding awareness, understanding consciousness, and moving in the direction of having greater peace and calmness and clarity, and ultimately action in their lives? What would you recommend?
One thing I really like is just it's super physical. It's just being complete, like doing kind of doing like a scan of your body. So whether while you're walking or you're sitting down, there's a practice. I think it's called yoga nidra. Yeah, yoga nidra, and
Mhm.
you kind of just lay down and you focus on each point of your body. So you can start with your toes, and then you feel like the sensation coming or the signals that your feet are sending you, and then move up your body slowly to your shin, to your knees, to your stomach, to your hands, to all the way up to your neck. And you'll realize that your body is constantly sending you signals, but we're always unaware of it because we're so kind of focused on the external environment. So, but if you actually close your eyes and then, you'll notice that when you breathe in, there's like a level you could feel like the oxygen going into your veins, or when you're walking, you could feel each step as you take. I think you should start if you're especially if you're like super new, start at a very physical level and try to be super conscious of every movement you make and don't let any movement go without your full awareness. And then you'll realize like, oh, there's a lot of things I do that I just take for granted that I never was really aware of. I was just doing it out of habit.
And for those who want to learn more about the Conscious Future Society, how would they contact you and do so?
So our website's the consciousfuturesociety.com. There's also an inquiry form on the website, but I'm gonna be working closely with a lot of the speakers now as we move forward towards the conference. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be a great discussion.
Well, I'm looking forward to it as well. Again, thank you for the invitation to participate. And I was, again, so excited to hear of it, number one, to be contacted, number two, then, of course, to receive the invitation, and then to learn that Bala Subramaniam and others were going to be in attendance as well. So it was
Mhm.
kind of like for me, this reconvening, if you will, from the
Mhm.
Sadhguru conference from October of last year was, again, it was a highlight of my really my month, it was my year for the matter. And so I thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your work. And I look forward to seeing you and whomever else will be in attendance on
Mhm.
Saturday, 25 April at Babson College. Chirag Kankariya, I want to thank you for your participation today in the International Meditation Hour. Again, I'm Dr. Baruti KMT-Sisouvong. I thank each of you for being here in attendance, those who are in person and those who view this online after it has been edited and shared. Your energy helps to make this, not only this work possible, but bringing the world to a better, more balanced state. As we said before, going from this idea of something being impossible to I'm possible, allowing the light of consciousness to rest within us and on us to then reverberate that and spread that into the world around us. Again, thank you for attending today's installment of the International Meditation Hour, and we'll see you next time.